Welcome to California Highways, Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about the numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by the California Highways webpage and Gribble Nation.
I'm Daniel Fagan. I'm the moderator and maintainer of the California Highways webpage.
I'm Tom Fear, one of four who writes on the Gribble Nation blog site.
This is episode 0.02, Route 105. It only takes a century. This episode is a sample episode. We've mapped out all the seasons, and we'll be digging into routes somewhere in the start of the second season. But we want to give you a taste of what the route by route approach will be. The first season is more background and history.
This episode is our initial version of the route by route episode. If this all goes to plan, we'll revisit Route 105 in season 17. By then, we may have refined the style and structure of how we record. The first Route 105 was Legislative Route 105, which was defined in 1933 as a state highway, coast road near Half Moon Bay to Legislative Route 2, which was U.S. Route 101 near San Mateo, San Jose, Richmond East Shore Highway near Mount Eden to Legislative Route 5, feature Interstate 680 near Hayward, Hayward via 14th Street and San Leandro to 7th and Cypress Streets in Oakland. In 1935, Legislative Route 105 was codified as Legislative Route 56, which was California State Route 1 near Half Moon Bay to Legislative Route 2 near San Mateo, Legislative Route 69, the East Shore Highway near Mount Eden to Legislative Route 5, which was California State Route 17 near Hayward, Hayward via 14th Street and San Leandro to 7th Street and Cypress Streets in Oakland. In 1949, Legislative Route 105 was changed to combine the first two segments into Legislative Route 56 near Half Moon Bay to Legislative Route 5 near Hayward. The 1949 acquisition of the San Mateo-Hayward Bridge basically brought the 1929 span into the state highway system. Previously, it was a private toll span enterprise. In 1953, Legislative Route 105 was truncated to the definition of B, former C, from 7th and Cypress Streets in Oakland to High Street in Oakland. In 1961, relaxed definition of Legislative Route 105, the definition of B, to simply originating in Hayward. Today, in the 1964 state highway renumbering, Route 92 to Route 238 in Oakland. It appears to run along Crystal Springs Avenue to 3rd Street in San Mateo. It is Jackson Street in Hayward. Hayward to High Street in Oakland, Route 77. This is present-day Route 185. At one point, it was signed as Route 17.
The next time the number 105 shows up is it's an interstate downtown. I'm not sure it was actually ever signed. It was a spur route, and you have to visualize this in your head. So recall that the San Bernardino Freeway, I-10, doesn't connect directly to Santa Monica Freeway. So if you look at it on a map, right, the San Bernardino Freeway comes in, there's a jog down the 5, and it goes over to the 10. So now imagine a triangle being formed, where you have the San Bernardino Freeway meeting the I-5, where the 101 meets the I-10, where it's the San Bernardino, and where the 101 meets I-5 and the I-10 going to Santa Monica. So that's a triangle. And originally they wanted to give each of those little short segments individual interstate numbers to get rid of US 101 in that area and stop US 101 when it first met the 10. So the short section of today's I-10 between the San Bernardino and I-5 and US 101 was to be I-110. The short section of US 101 between the I-10 that goes to Santa Monica and the I-10 that goes to San Bernardino was to be I-105. And then that third leg would have been I-5. So you've got what was to be I-110 at the top, I-105 over on the west, and I-5 over on the east is the triangle. But that was confusing. It was never really signed. And so in 1968, they changed things around. They transferred Route 105 to US 101, and that all became 101 that we see that goes to I-5. Route 110 was transferred to I-10. It's unclear whether it was actually added to the interstate mileage. So you now saw the I-10 that goes to San Bernardino go all the way to the 101. And the former mileage of 105 and 110 was added to the future 105.
the whole situation in the original 105 and 110 is just like bizarre to me. Like you're trying to figure that out. And if I remember right, isn't the spur 110, wasn't it kind of like a spur of I-10 now, and it's not even really signed as anything other than it has 10 post miles?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It is not signed really as anything. That little bit of the spur of the I-10, because they want people to think that the I-10 goes down the 5, not the 101. and so it's really confusing. Now, while this was all happening, elsewhere in the state highway system, there were a whole batch of things going on that would lead to what becomes today's Route 105. And Tom's going to tell you about that.
So Sign Route 10 was defined in 1934 as Junction Route 3, which was future US 101A and later Route 1, south of Venice to Junction US 101 in Santa Ana via Manchester Avenue and Santa Ana Boulevard. This was renumbered to Route 42 to prevent conflict with Interstate 10. This is due to the state not allowing duplication of sign route numbers. The Great Renumbering brought changes. Route 90 was created, running from Route 1 northwest of Los Angeles International Airport to Route 605. Route 42 was redefined as Route 1 west of Inglewood to Route 91 in Santa Ana Canyon by the vicinity of Norwalk. Route 42 defined in 1965. Section A from Route 1 west of Inglewood to Route 605, and Section B, Route 39 near La Habra to Route 91 in Santa Ana Canyon.
Now, the Century Freeway planning began all the way back in 1949, if you can believe it. The 1949 proposed parkway system from the Auto Club of Southern California showed an Inglewood to Slauson Parkway that ran a little further north from roughly where the 405 and Florence come together to near Normandy and Slauson. And then it ran roughly along Slauson and Randolph over to the Santa Ana Parkway. Now, you know about Route 10, Route 42 with LRN 174, with the segment added in 1965 was being LRN 176. Tom just mentioned that. By 1956, the concept of what was called the Century Freeway was emerging. This was distinct from the Slauson Parkway, which was Route 90, and the concept ran from near Century and the 405 to the Long Beach Freeway, meeting near the junction with the Rio Hondo Freeway, probably something you've never heard of, Route 164. The routing was about 12.4 miles long, with a cost to complete of about $71 million. That number will go up, you'll see. By 1958, the routing was recommended to extend as far as the Santa Ana Freeway, Route 5, but it still was not in the state system yet. By 1961, there was some basic route research taking place. This was for a route from Lincoln Boulevard, which was then US 101A, to the Santa Ana Freeway. By 1963, there were actually location studies being started in public hearings with a planned number of Route 42, why it was such a significant route. And by the end of 65, the Transportation Commission had adopted a route extending from Route 1 near the southeast corner of Flax to Central Avenue in Los Angeles. And for those not familiar, Central Avenue is just a little bit east of what is now the 110, sort of halfway between the harbor and the Long Beach. This shows on a 66 state map as the routing for Route 105.
So big changes were ahead in 1968. Just as previously hinted, 1968 was a big year for the future Century Freeway corridor. In 1963, Route 105 was deleted, meaning the legislative routes as part of the 1964 highway renumbering. 1963, 110 was deleted as well. 1963, Route 42 was parceled out. Section A, from Route 1 west of Inglewood to Route 605, became future Route 105. Section B, Route 39 near La Habra to Route 91 in Santa Ana Canyon went to Route 90. New Route 105 as an interstate corridor was created.
Now, this became an interstate due to some mileage gains. We'll mention this in the future in our interstate episode, but when the interstate system was created, there was a maximum number of miles authorized legislatively by Congress of, I want to say it's 44,000 miles total. And that number was later increased at some point. And they could not add miles to the interstate system at that point without special gains. So the mileage that they got for 105 came from some tricks in the U.S. Code 103, Section 23. I always screw up reading U.S. Code numbers. And the Howard Kramer Act. 10.3 miles of the 17-mile route came from the U.S. Code Section E1. 7 miles were Howard Kramer substitutions from another section. The mileage came from Interstate 80, with the mileage in San Francisco being withdrawn, Interstate 280, which was 6.7 miles coming over from when they did the whole freeway rework in downtown San Francisco. So you can thank the whole freeway revolt in San Francisco for giving us 105. Same thing with the mileage that came from Interstate 480, the old Embarcadero freeway. And, of course, the mileage we just mentioned that came from the former spur routes in downtown, 105 and 110.
All right, so I think it's important that people really understand that are listening that the early interstate system was heavily subsidized funding-wise by the federal government. This is why you're seeing so much mileage shifting around, is because there was federal matching that went along with funding the early interstate corridors. So basically, if there's like a California state route that was built up to a freeway, it was pretty much up to the state to find funding for that, whereas the interstates had large funding matching by the federal government as part of the whole interstate highway system.
When they initially authorized the interstate system, there was a fixed number of miles, and they could not go over that. Later changes allowed them to have things they could sign as interstates under special conditions. We're not running into that here. We'll see that with things like 110 and the 710. But in order to build this new stuff with federal funding, they had to get the miles from somewhere since the system was maxed out, and thus they had to play those mileage games, bringing the miles from San Francisco and downtown. One of the big questions for Interstate 105 that I see all the time is, why doesn't it go to I-5? I mean, you would think it would go all the way from 405 to I-5, and that would be a no-brainer. But it ends at Route 605, and there are a number of reasons. First was neighborhood opposition. Norwalk did not want new freeway construction in their city, and the cities have to give the right-of-way to the state. They have to allow the alignment to go through, and Norwalk would not do that. And the cost of rerouting around Norwalk just didn't work. Secondly, when they built Interstate 105, the capacity of I-5 just wasn't there at the connection point. If you think about all the construction that's been going on I-5 since around 2010, it has all been to widen the portion of I-5 north of the Orange County line, which was incredibly narrow and always crowded. And if you were to dump the end of the 105 into that, it just could not handle the interchange. It just would not work. And so, although additional capacity was planned far in the future, the 605 interchange was a better place to dump things, as there was more space and road capacity for the collector and the transition lane. That's why it doesn't end at I-5.
I think it's important to note that much of the Santa Ana Freeway corridor south of downtown was built in the 1950s before the interstate system was around. So it was not up to the same standard as much as the interstate system we see today is.
Anytime I had to go to Orange County, I would always dread driving the I-5 in that section because it was so narrow. It was always backed up, and the 405 was always the better option, at least for me coming from the valley. Now, the building of Interstate 105 had its share of controversies, and I'm going to let Tom talk about those.
Class action lawsuit filed in 1972 to block construction 1 month before the scheduled groundbreaking. Lawyers sued to win a far broader compensation for residents who were losing their homes for freeway construction. Suit sought to injunction to prevent the state from acquiring property until environmental impact statements were approved. So if you're kind of thinking things post-1970 world, if you're ever wondering why it takes public works projects so long to build now, is because you need an EIS, or environmental impact study, conducted. This complaint also alleged inadequate relocation assistance, denial equal protection to minorities and low-income corridor residents, inadequate public hearings, and violation of due process. Numerous impact surveys were ordered, settled by consent decree during 1975. Decree reduced the width of the freeway, included housing programs, job training programs, affirmative action programs, and child care programs. 3,000 single-family homes and a 1,200 multifamily building to be constructed in neighborhoods along the freeway corridor. 25,000 displaced residents living in the corridor would also be able to buy homes at below market rate. 65% of workers on both freeway and housing would be minorities. 10% would also be women. Nearly 5,000 locals went through the apprenticeship program and were given construction jobs. The construction of daycare centers for families of employees was part of the decree. Required transit in the freeway right-of-way.
You know, the one thing that this shows you is that we often think of freeways as just being constructed, lay down the concrete. And there's just so much more that goes into construction that people don't see into the cost. And this is a really good example of that. And as a result,
cost estimates for construction rose substantially during the 1970s. It led to scaling back of the scope. 2 planned lanes were dropped. Amended consent decree approved by court order during 1981, stating that the approved project would have 6 lanes for general traffic, 2 high-occupancy vehicle lanes, a medium busway not wider than 64 feet, convertible to light rail metered ramps, required new construction of 3,700 housing units. Also, the western terminus changed to south boundary of Los Angeles International Airport near El Segundo from Route 1. Route 1 represented the Pacific Coast Freeway, which was proposed.
Note the uniqueness of this. This was really one of the first projects that built transit into the freeway itself as it was being constructed originally.
Caltrans was pressured by the Federal Highway Administration to begin construction of Interstate 105 and the Century Freeway prior to 1986, given it was a chargeable interstate. Initial work on the Interstate 105 and Century Freeway corridor would begin during 1982, but would progress slowly. 1992, Legislative Chapter 1243 changed the western terminus of Interstate 105 to Perishing Drive near El Segundo. The first segment of Interstate 105 opened in 1993. Highway would be fully complete during 1994, which I think, if I recall correctly, the movie Speed came out in 1993, and it heavily featured Interstate 105 in it right before it was completed.
I'll add an anecdote on this. I worked down near Interstate 105 in El Segundo, and I started working there in 1988. So I was driving through that entire construction area where the 105 and the 405 come together while it was being built. They took out part of a building. There's a transition from the southbound 405 to the westbound 105 that goes seemingly within 10 feet of an office building on the high flyover corridor. It was just fascinating to watch how they were constructing the freeway during that last period while it was opening.
I believe they showed up in Lethal Weapon 4 also, if I remember right.
It was used for a lot of filming. If I recall correctly, the interchange of the 105 and the 110 was also used in La La Land. There's the infamous opening sequence where they're dancing and singing on the freeway ramp. There are a whole batch of interesting names associated with the 105, and we'll go through a lot of them. It is locally known as the Century Freeway. This is because when it starts, it's right near Century Boulevard and goes along Century and Imperial. Formally, it's known as the Glenn Anderson Freeway, and we'll talk about who Glenn Anderson is in a minute. And that was named in 87. As it was defined in 1969, though, it was given the names the El Segundo Freeway west of the I-405 and the Norwalk Freeway east of 405, but those names were really never used, and I found no evidence that they were ever signed. The completion of 105 led to the relinquishment of all of Route 42. But you wouldn't know that because there was vestige Route 42 signage still in place today on roads like La Cienega Boulevard, and I can tell you, for the longest time, the exit for La Cienega in Manchester was labeled Route 42, even though Route 42 hadn't existed for 10 years.
There's still some Route 42 reassurance shields still out there. They're all faded away, but they're there. Yeah,
it's one of those roads where the number seems to be loved, even though the route is long gone. Now, one of the interesting names on 105 really isn't on 105, but the story behind it is so fascinating, and that's Imperial Highway. 105, especially for the portion between the 405 and the 110, pretty much goes along Imperial Highway. And the name comes from the Imperial Valley. And you're going to go, why would Imperial Highway deal with the Imperial Valley? Well, the Los Angeles area wanted to build a superhighway that went from the Pacific all the way to Brawley in the Imperial Valley, 215 miles. And it was later extended to El Centro. And the route was basically a combination of a number of existing routes. The old Butterfield Stage Route, which is what became Route 78 and 79 to Temecula. It then went to Corona via Lake Elsinore and Temescal Canyon. This was Route 71 and later was roughly Route 15, I-15. It then went down to Santa Ana Canyon on its way to Yorba Linda, which is now Route 91. It then went to La Habra via Route 90, which is Imperial Highway, and then went across LA County to meet the sea at El Segundo as Imperial Highway. This was, as you can see, replaced by other highways, and most of it wasn't called Imperial Highway, but there are still 2 segments called Imperial Highway, the segment in LA County and a segment in El Centro. I think that's just a really neat story. Most people wouldn't realize that just looking at Imperial Highway. Some other names that I'll talk about: Glenn Anderson. We heard this is called the Glenn Anderson Freeway. Glenn Anderson was the U.S. congressman that represented that portion of LA County, and he was instrumental in getting the federal funding for the transportation projects in the region, including the Metro Red Line subway, I think now is the A line, and the I-105 freeway. The other name that I always think of, as I said, I work near the 405 and the 105, is Sadio E. Munimori. You see these interchanges named after people, and you go, who are they? I preserve all of those naming things and have the stories on my website. This was named in 1994. He was an American of Japanese ancestry, served in the 100th Infantry Battalion of the U.S. Army, which was mostly Japanese Americans from Hawaii. This became part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was the most highly decorated unit in World War II for its size and time in combat. In March 1945, Private Munimori and his company were ordered back to northern Italy to join the forces in the push against the Gustav Line, which was a fortified German position that held up Allied advance for more than 4 months. On April 5, 1945, they came under murderous fire, and its commander, Lieutenant David Novak, and squad leader, Staff Sergeant Yamaguchi, were severely wounded, and the private took command and single-handedly, using grenades, knocked out 2 enemy machine guns, giving his own life to save 2 of his comrades when he used his own body to shield them from an exploding grenade. So when you drive through that interchange, now you know the story about why that guy is there. And it's sort of appropriate. It's right near the LA Space Force base, and it's also right near where they were building airplanes for World War II over at Northrop Grumman, right at the corner of the airport.
So next interchange would be the Judge Harry Predgerson interchange with 110. This was named in 2002, presided over a Century Freeway lawsuit for more than 2 decades starting in 1972. Kept control of the case for more than a dozen years after he was elevated to the Court of Appeals. Ensured construction of nearly 5,000 affordable housing units to replace homes removed to make way for the Century Freeway. Oversaw a housing program under the consent decree from 1972 to 1995. Assisted that a major portion of the construction jobs go to minorities and women. When there was not enough minorities and women qualified for the jobs, he helped create a construction apprenticeship program for them. The Century Freeway Housing Program, now known as the Century Housing Corporation, a nonprofit organization, grew out of the settlement of the Century Freeway lawsuit presided over by Judge Predgerson, and provided funds to acquire the Westwide Residence Hall, which houses 500 formerly homeless veterans and is the largest housing and employment center of homeless veterans in the country. Settlement of the Century Freeway lawsuit permitted construction of Interstate 105, known as the Century Freeway.
Now, there were some major problems with the Century Freeway, and the biggest one that they ran into was a real groundwater problem. The original design of the freeway had both elevated ground level and below ground level portions. And you'll see this often in freeway construction. They'll dig something in a trench and take the dirt from the trench and build an elevated portion. And there were some problems with the 3.5 mile below ground section, which is between the 710 and the 605. It was originally shorter, and it was extended in 1981 west towards the 710 and the LA River. Now, according to the reports I found, Caltrans did not do extensive tests of the soils and the groundwater conditions before construction. They believed the groundwater was 30 feet below the construction level. However, Caltrans was impacted by the actions of another agency, which as a result of overpumping the groundwater basin in that area in the 50s, was replenishing the basin, which raised the groundwater level. The net result was cracking and sinking of that section, which required some really extensive repairs. I think all of that stuff has now been done and it's stable, but it was a really large amount of repairs that occurred at the time. There are also some projects taking place currently on the 105. The biggest is converting the existing HOV lanes to express lanes. 105 was unique. It was constructed with HOV and light rail in the center of the freeway from the get-go. Studies began in 2010 to convert the HOV to the HOT, the express lane, toll lane approach. Additional funding came from a 2016 local sales tax, and in 2019, the public meeting started on alternative design. The whole process now requires loads of public meetings before you even can finalize designs and do the EIR. The alternatives included one express lane and 2 express lanes with both standard and non-standard lane widths. The draft environmental report was released in May 2020, and the all-standard lane width option was dropped just because it required too much right-of-way acquisition. They got additional funding in December 2020. As of August 2021, there had been approval for future consideration of funding. That's sort of the stage where they say, yeah, you can go and start work on this. We haven't allocated the funds yet, but when you say you're ready, we'll start allocating the funds and you can build it. It was programmed in the 2020 State Transportation Improvement Plan for a total of $609 million and change, with construction supposedly starting in the 2023-2024 fiscal year.
For more information, check out California Highways pages on Route 105, Route 42, Route 90, Route 10, Gribble Nation blogs on former California State Route 42 and former California State Route 10, Interstate 105. In our path, Interstate 105, the flight for a changing Los Angeles, Access Magazine, the Century Freeway, designed by court decree. We'll have all these links in the blog posts for the episode on caroutebyroute.org.
This was a sample episode to show you the route-by-route structure. Season 1, which we hope to start recording later in June, will present the background of the state highway system. We're going to go through the history of the system, a lot of the information in the chronology section of my website. So how did California go from having its first fledgling state highways allocated and unsigned to the full freeway system we have today? We'll be going in details of how routes are numbered, how do the state shield routes get their number, how are interstates numbered, and we'll show you why some of what was in that video you see going around was right, and some of it just didn't tell the whole story. We'll talk about how routes are named, and what are all these organizations you hear about? What do we mean when we talk about the Transportation Commission and AASHTO and things like that? Season 2 will start the route exploration. We'll pretty much focus on just Route 1 and Route 2. There is that much information on those 2 routes alone. And we've plotted out all of the seasons, and you can find them in our episode list up on caroutebyroute.org. As always, information on the episode, and we will put up a page on this episode, will be available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can also leave us comments on the episode.
This episode is also available on our Anchor FM home, anchor.fm/CA Route by Route. Production is continuing for our first real episode, so as we say, watch this feed and
join us as we continue to explore California highways route by route. This episode was written by Daniel Fagan and Tom Fearer, edited by Daniel Fagan. Our opening theme is I Like to Be by the Seaside by John H. Liver-Kind. Do you have an opening theme you might be thinking is good for our show and it's either in the public domain or you're willing to let us use? If so, drop me an email at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. Thanks to Stephen Nanook Burkholder for some audio editing tips and tricks. That is really a tongue twister. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribble Nation at gribblnation.org. And if you might be interested in becoming a supporter of the podcast, once we've got that set up, please contact me at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. And with that, I think it's time we say goodbye, Tom.
see you next time.